Welcome to a special session of Reclaiming the Sierra workshop. How in tune are you with your environment to interpret the communications of nature? What are the natural indicators of seasonal shifts that occur in your local surroundings? Why does knowing the food web enable you to understand the interaction of shifts within a system? In this session, I will be talking about traditional environmental knowledge, what it is, examples of it, where to find it, and the implications to fire and water in our region. My name is Don Hankins, and I'm a professor of geography and planning and field director for the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves. My familiarity with traditional environmental knowledge stems from my experiences as a Muco traditional cultural practitioner. I'm a weaver, a gatherer, a hunter, fisher, and a burner. I have been fortunate to know and work with many traditional cultural practitioners since my youth, and that has expanded as I've ventured out into other areas of the world, including Australia. But I've worked extensively here in California amongst my own people and other tribal communities where people have shared information with me. Traditional practices form a basis or a guide to much of the work that I do in stewardship and conservation, particularly on the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves, where we do a lot of our stewardship based on traditional knowledge and the emulation of those traditional practices for the region. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share some of these insights with you. So what is traditional environmental knowledge? Often we're familiar with the term TEK or the acronym TEK that is used to describe it, and many of us may be familiar with the term traditional ecological knowledge versus traditional environmental knowledge. Either of those terms are pretty interchangeable. However, I think I rather prefer the term environmental knowledge over ecological knowledge because it's not all ecological in terms of the sense of the types of knowledge that we're referring to. In general sense, traditional environmental knowledge is knowledge that's gained through many generations of living in place, having a very strong familiarity, connection to the environment, having an awareness of the seasonal shifts, where and when and how plants and animals are interacting within that landscape, and the feedback mechanisms that are operating in that particular system. And I think among some of the things that help to distinguish traditional environmental knowledge, it's important to think that oftentimes we're associating with this traditional environmental knowledge with indigenous communities, but it's not entirely within indigenous communities where this knowledge base exists. And so, for instance, I think about long-term intergenerational families that have lived in certain areas of California for many generations. And in particular, I think of farming families that maybe have been living in certain places in the valley or in the foothills. And so, in that case, the term traditional environmental knowledge is applicable, it's appropriate. However, there are also the indigenous knowledge side of it that is important to recognize, and within some circles there's the indigenous knowledge or IK subpart of traditional environmental knowledge that is important to note. Overall, I would say that the collection of knowledge that exists, say from indigenous knowledge, which is very broad, it's very obviously connected to place for long periods of time, in many cases for millennia, versus the shorter generations of maybe 100 years or maybe a couple hundred years that might be part of traditional environmental knowledge for, say, farming families or other families that have been in place but are not indigenous to an area. So I guess when we think about traditional environmental knowledge, it can be broken down into other types of knowledge systems. This is why I use that term environmental knowledge more than ecological knowledge, is that it can be based off of weather and climate, knowledge of soils, water quality, vegetation, fire, and many other attributes that are part of that surrounding. So one might often ask how science fits in with traditional environmental knowledge. And the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In terms of environmental knowledge is often time-tested, it's proven within a landscape. It, in many ways, almost exists as law within places. And in some cases, as I'll talk about it in a little while, the examples of law within indigenous society are related to the laws of nature. And so when I say that the science aspect and traditional environmental knowledge side are not mutually exclusive, that's what I'm referring to. So there's a place for science and there's a place for traditional environmental knowledge to work hand in hand. And I guess if we think about some of the basis of that knowledge, it's based off of observation in place over time and the adaptive management around things. So when we think about the development of, say, fire knowledge and fire effects that indigenous communities in California had a very strong understanding of, that comes from understanding the repeated application of fire under very specific conditions to yield very specific outcomes. And that is something that I would say is very much in line with the scientific methodology, but it's not obviously written up in a way that people would do nowadays, but is a way of being able to inform long-term how and what are the best ways of operating in a particular place. And I also think about the opportunities that exist that also help to distinguish science from traditional environmental knowledge. And in particular, I think about the opportunities that exist on the fire side of things, where we've got a lot of invasive species that have moved into our landscape here in California. And the specific stewardship of those invasive species may not fall in line with the traditional environmental knowledge or indigenous knowledge systems that exist in a place. So when we think about invasive grasses, for instance, and how we steward those with fire versus our native species, there are definitely some opportunities where science plays maybe a little bit more of an opportunity for following into, aside from applying fire through traditional ways, to then think about, well, how do we monitor, how do we study this to inform then the best way of dealing with that invasive species. So those are the kind of opportunities that exist around merging science and traditional environmental knowledge. And I would say that there's a lot of opportunity that exists around traditional environmental knowledge, and I think there's a lot of interest in it that's gaining in society. But I think there's also a word of caution that we need to be aware of, and that is, what's the system for ensuring that that knowledge is safeguarded, is respected, is empowering indigenous people or local people the ability to steward those resources themselves versus, say, an agency coming in, taking that knowledge in an extractive way, appropriating knowledge, but also look for opportunities to support or allow to be led by indigenous knowledge holders or traditional environmental knowledge holders, and to give them and their knowledge a place in stewarding the landscape and not in an extractive way. This knowledge system is really strongly ingrained in communities over long periods of time, and I think about very specific examples from the desert Southwest in California, Mojave Desert region in particular, with the bird songs from the tribal groups like Cahuilla, Mojave, Quetzan, and other tribes in the area. And those bird songs are very important because they provide not only a map of the landscape, but also if you know those songs and you know your place within the landscape, you'll know what species you'll see in these particular places, which birds you'll see, what flowering plants you'll see, where different bodies of water are, based on that knowledge of that song that is a map of the landscape. So when we think about bringing these examples closer to home, I think of some of the examples that we may be a little bit more familiar with, and those include the weather indicators. And for me in particular, living in Butte County and living on a ridge that is within the migratory pathway of a lot of our waterfowl, I pay attention in particular to the winter migrations and spring migrations of birds like snow geese, sandhill cranes, and then between weather systems, I also pay attention to smaller species like the passerines, like Oregon juncos, for instance, that help us to understand when there might be a weather system coming through the area. And so there's those basic examples of just paying attention to the local environment and things that are going on. But I think we also have the opportunities to pay attention to the broader changes that are taking place. And I think about the art that traditionally existed within our Miwok societies of being able to read the sky. And these are very specific knowledge sets that if you have an awareness of being able to read the sky, you can often tell long range what the weather systems are going to be. If we have the ability to read the sky, we might know what the forecasting of the weather systems might be for, say, the next several months or something like that. So I think about where to find traditional environmental knowledge, and the specific places where we might find it include traditional stories. So, those stories might tell us about what phenomena exist where and within what landscapes. We think about which species are associated with one another that might be told about in those stories. And these stories also offer insights to the indicators of ecological health. And I also think about the opportunities that language and knowledge of language provides. And indigenous languages are full of contextual and specific knowledge of place, but interpreting that knowledge requires a deeper knowledge base of the culture and the context of where and what those specific terms mean. As a speaker of Muko, I understand that there are specific terms in our language to describe the seasons that we have. I know that there's more than 4 seasons that are represented in our language. And I also know from our language that there are very specific terms about fire weather that are very specific things that we have to pay attention to within our landscape. But if you're not familiar with the language and you're not familiar with the culture and you're not familiar with the landscape, you're not going to have an understanding of that, and you may not even know to look for those specific things within the language. Then I also think about the opportunities that connections with traditional cultural practitioners provides. So spending time in place, paying attention to the changes in site conditions, and having a long-term knowledge of place are something that traditional cultural practitioners have. So thinking about basket weavers, thinking about people who go out and hunt or fish in specific places, and their families have been hunting and fishing and gathering in these places for many generations. These are the kinds of opportunities and knowledge-based systems that we might be able to think about. And then I would say that if there isn't access to these sorts of things, to think about the observations in place that one can create for themselves. And that is, paying attention to the environment and opening yourself up to what the world is communicating, which birds are in the area and what those birds are telling me about the weather systems and other things that are taking place. And the world is always communicating these things, but if we're not paying attention to it, if we're walking around with our earbuds in, or we're just not paying attention in other sense, then we're not connecting with the environment in that particular way. So I want to next talk a little bit about traditional knowledge of fire and water stewardship. And this is just very briefly to think about how indigenous perspectives of fire and water are interrelated in the way that indigenous societies, both here in California and folks that I work with in Australia and elsewhere in North America, there's a very strong sense of the way that people see the relationship between fire and water, and that they are really one and the same. So some of that knowledge is encoded in stories, like I was referring to, and some of it is simply just a relationship that, if we think about the existence of fire, that often comes counter to the existence of water. What I mean by that is that in drier years, we know that we can expect for more fire to exist and vice versa. And thus the stewardship of one is inherently the stewardship of the other in some way or another. In the old days, people knew to burn the landscape to reduce the density of vegetation in order to increase the flows in the streams, to ensure water quality through not having devastating fires. And traditional burning facilitates infiltration by enhancing soil conditions and moisture retention, particularly through the creation of black carbon, which I know there's a presentation on biochar at this workshop. So thinking about those particular connections and how the right kinds of fire in the right places at the right times can really create these kind of very beneficial attributes as a product of that type of fire in a relationship with water. So each system has a very specific range of fires that we need to be thinking about for stewardship of, and that might fall within a very specific range of seasons that a certain community might burn. So if we want to consider things like slope and aspect and the moisture levels of those plants and how frequently fire has been in that place and what the outcomes of applying fire, say at one season versus another season, will dictate fire behavior and fire effects from that particular fire. So knowing and using fire requires a knowledge of how, where, when, what, why, and who around those particular fires. So thinking about how the fire is being lit, where it's being lit, when, what's being burned, why is it being burned, and then who is being affected by the fire and who is setting the fire are all things that have to be considered. So indicators of when to burn are frequently linked to phenological conditions of plants, but may also link to the presence or absence of wildlife and specific weather patterns, and even the celestial cues. So if we think about the position of the moon, we look at what's going on with the stars, and those sorts of connections, those are all things that we all have to pay attention to if we're going to engage in these activities within the landscape. As I wrap up, I want us to think about the world around us is continuously communicating with us, but are we paying attention? If we read the communications of the world around us, we can learn how to be better stewards. Being an effective steward involves paying attention to interspecific relationships and developing reciprocal relationships with our environment. And I hope that this session has provided some insight into the utility and scientific relevance of traditional environmental knowledge. Thank you.